back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Today, we are joined by Eric Zandona. Over the past decade, Eric has worked to educate and spread awareness of well-crafted spirits. Along with his wife, Tia, Eric runs EZdrinking, a spirits blog and consultancy. As an independent agency, they post unbiased reviews, curate spirits events, and provide a variety of consulting services from product development to marketing strategies for spirit brands. Along with operating EZdrinking, Eric runs public presentations and tasting events and is a writer for several articles and books. In 2018, Eric was a shortlist nominee for the International Wine and Spirits Competition's Spirits Communicator of the Year Award. And his books, The Bourbon Bible and The Tequila Dictionary, were both selected by the Tales of the Cocktail Awards Committee as top 10 nominees for Best New Books on Drinks Culture, History, and Spirits. In addition, Eric consults to help clients develop and bring new spirits to market, providing product feedback and information about trends in the industry. All right, so let's get into it. Without further ado, we welcome Eric to the Beer Bound Podcast. Eric, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's get into it. Eric, we started off with a little bit, but can you go a little bit further into who you are and maybe why you're so interested in hard alcoholic beverages and spirits? Maybe give us a bit more information on you.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I came of age for drinking, which 21 in California, I had a bunch of friends who were interested in craft beer. And, so that was, just starting to really grow. It had kind of been in this nascent form for a while and then was really starting to take off. And there are a lot of interesting craft brewers in the Bay Area and in Northern California. And so I started with some of those and kind of getting familiarized with different styles and things like that. But another friend of mine had decided to purchase a cocktail book and a whole bunch of bottles from a local liquor store and just start making cocktails and see what he liked. And so he invited me over and we tried a few different things and didn't really enjoy the tequila sunrise. It was a little bit too sweet and tart for me. But he had a bunch of neat spirits that we tried. And one of them was a single malt scotch. And it was the first spirit that I had that my brain lit up when I tasted it. And I really was intrigued about where those flavors came from and how that happened. Because I had tried some other stuff and it was like, okay, this is interesting, or I don't know, a little weird or whatever. But that one really captivated me. And I was like, oh, I want to learn more about this. And I had already kind of done that a little bit with beer. I had read some of the books by Michael Jackson, the beer writer, and about different styles and things like that. And so I kind of understood there was a base level of different ingredients, different processes affect flavor. And so that really kind of got me interested in spirits. And so over time, I kind of had this kind of dual track where, really interested in following some of the, early 2000s trends in craft beer, and then started to notice some of the spirit brands that were, popular in my area, and trying a few different things like gin and tequila, and each of them were different, but really intriguing to me. And some of them I liked and some of them I didn't. And I did a very probably nerdy thing where I bought a book, which is now out of print. And it was called the Spirits Buyer's Guide or something like that. It was written by the Beverage Tasting Institute out of Chicago. And it was a really good primer for spirits. They'd have a chapter about like what is whiskey, what is brandy, what is gin, and then they'd have all these commercial examples with little tasting notes. And so I went to my local liquor store and I bought as many minis as I could, the little 50 ml bottles, and would taste them and like read the tasting notes and try and understand like the language of spirits with the flavors that I was getting. And so I made little notes about what I liked and what flavors I thought I was tasting. And that kind of started me in this journey. And I was, for a long time, it was just for fun, just something I really was interested in. And not so much into cocktails, but more just like neat spirits. And then eventually in 2011, I got married to my wife, Tia, and I was a full-time graduate student and she was working part-time, I think, at the time. And so I needed more income. And so I was trying to figure out how to do that. And I reached out to a man named Bill Owens, who founded the American Distilling Institute and who had been a founding, craft brewer in the Bay Area at Buffalo Bills, and asked him if he knew if any local distilleries had any internships or job openings. And he emailed me right away and was like, well, I have a bunch of work nobody has time to do. So why don't you come to my office and let's talk? And so we did, and I started working for him, and I didn't look back. And I finished my degree and started working for him and doing some books, and eventually started working for their competition. And a couple of years in, I started running that competition for spirits producers. And I've just been in this industry ever since. I really, really love it.
All right. So Eric, take us back a little bit. Garrett and I are quite interested in beer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to know that you have a bit of a background and interest, obviously coming from the Bay Area. That's quite a mecca of beer and craft breweries, certainly in the last few decades. Okay, but take us back a little bit. You found some more complexity, you said, in a single malt scotch that you tried, and then some more experimentations. What is a spirit in terms of in differentiating it between different alcoholic beverages? You mentioned cocktails. So boil it down. What constitutes a spirit?
So a spirit at its base level is any fermented substance, whether that's grain, fruit, honey, whey, potatoes, sugar cane. You take that and then you distill it, which is essentially you separate most of the water from the alcohol by using the principle of the differentiation and boiling points between water and alcohol. So water, or alcohol rather, boils at a lower temperature than water. So when you heat up a mixture of grain ferment, say that like a beer, or a sugar ferment, or a honey ferment, or wine from grapes, things like that, the alcohol will start to evaporate before the water does. And so the vapors will travel up off of the liquid. And in the still where this is happening, it's designed so that the vapors will travel up to a certain height, and then they will go down into some sort of tube where the constriction of the space and the temperature will recondense those liquids into a higher concentrated alcohol beverage, basically. And for a long time, most spirits were made using what we call a pot still, and you would generally do this distillation process twice. So whether you were starting off from basically an unhopped beer or wine, you would distill it once, and you would get anywhere from like 5 to 7% up to like 30% alcohol in that first distillation. And then you would collect enough to refill the still, and then you would do it again. And then you would end up with a spirit that was somewhere in the order of 70% alcohol. And then depending on your product, your style that you're working with or whatever, you might bottle it at that strength. You might put it in a barrel You might bring it down in proof with the addition of water and then sell it unaged. It all kind of depends. So, but that's at the base level, is you take some fermented liquid and then distill it and you get a spirit. And that's the basics.
Is it suffice to say that most hard alcohols that we know today that folks like to perhaps consume in a shot form or in a neat glass, such as tequila, vodka, whiskey, rum, are those all spirits?
Yes, so those are all spirits. And so all of those go through a distillation process. Now, as you may know, and your listeners may know, there are other sort of forms of distillation. There was a practice known as freeze distillation, where that was sometimes referred to as jacking. So the old time apple jack, which is basically an apple brandy, was some believed the practice was that you would make an apple cider, leave it out in the winter, the ice would freeze, the water would freeze at a warmer temperature than the alcohol would. And so then you would take the ice off and then it would increase the alcoholic strength. I know BrewDog did some experiments with sort of increasing the strength of beer without distillation, and they got pretty high using a number of different methods. But so that's sort of an outlier. But since the 1300s, at least, distillation was well sort of practiced, and it got better over time, but the basic physics of it had been really figured out. And so all the spirits that we know of today, like brandy, whiskey, gin, tequila, vodka, rum, all of those are distilled spirits.
So, Eric, is this a European concoction? So is it fair to say that prior to, I think you said the 13th century?
Yeah, somewhere in the 1300s is really when you start to see distillation in Europe take off. So the distillation technology itself predates that. Early distillation technology has been found in Greece and in the Arab world. The Egyptians and people in Morocco and in the, I guess, would have been the Ottoman Empire, maybe at that point. My knowledge of that history is a little fuzzy. They were making perfumes through distillation because in Islam, the consumption of alcohol is prohibited. So they were using the technology for making perfumes. And the Europeans got the technology through the sort of cultural exchange in Spain and the Mediterranean world. And they were just like, well, perfumes are nice, but let's make something we can have fun with. And so that's an exaggeration, but they basically started using it for making beverage alcohol. Initially just medicines like tinctures of different plants, but eventually they figured out like, well, if we drink it, and it can be kind of fun too, so we'll do that. But distillation technology has been found in China and in Mongolia as well, so it goes really far back. China has a whole different method of distillation that is fascinating. They create a spirit called baijiu, and which is primarily made from a fermented mash of sorghum and other grains, but they keep the sorghum in a solid block. It's not liquid like you would have with a beer mash. And they use a variety of enzymes and bacteria to break down the starches into fermentable sugars, and then yeast ferments the sugar into alcohol, but it's a solid mass. And then they shovel that solid mass into a still and they percolate steam through it, and that strips out the alcohol. So it's a little different methodology, but it gets you the same sort of result. And so that technology traveled east towards the New World, and European technology traveled west towards the New World. And so there's some debate about whether or not Mexico inherited distilling technology from the Spanish or from the Philippines. And so there's that debate is not settled. And but it's an interesting idea that distillation technology kind of started in what I guess you might call Southwest Asia, so current day Middle East, countries, and then traveled north to Europe, and then also started in East Asia and China, and then moved out from there. So there's probably at least 2 or 3 original sort of creations of distillation as a technology, that at least in the world and are independent of each other. But by and large, most of the world uses the European sort of methodology of distillation. And whereas still today, China has its own practice, and you see that in some other places. But most people are using sort of what has become the sort of outgrowth of the European adoption of distillation.
It's very interesting how that's expanded and evolved. Is are distillers like purists in that matter, or has there ever been some maybe Frankenstein contraption of distilling that takes a little bit of each world, or what does that look like?
There are some distillers in the US who are of Chinese or other East Asian descent that are using the like solid state fermentation methods to make baijiu. But most people, like I said before, distillation technology was pretty well understood by the 1300s. It improved, but the basic idea was well understood. And then it wasn't until the 1850s that the column still was really improved with what's called the coffee still. It's named after a man. So it's not spelled like the drink coffee. It's spelled slightly different. And so he made the real breakthrough on continuous distillation, which is able to give you a lighter spirit in a much more efficient method of production. And so then you see the introduction of things like blended scotch, and where you have a heavier pot still distillate that you blend with a lighter column still distillate, and you get something new out of that. So that didn't happen until the 1850s. And after that, then that technology spread throughout the world and came to the US, and most of the large distillers in the US adopted the column still pretty quickly for production of bourbon and for other whiskeys. And in Illinois, there was a giant consortium of distillers that were all kind of owned by one group they called the Whiskey Trust. And they were pumping out huge amounts of alcohol using these column stills, and then feeding all the stillage to cows and then slaughtering them and then shipping all the beef to Chicago. So there was this whole ecosystem that existed, with the dramatic improvement of the technology.
Eric, tell us about your venture, your consultancy, your blog, EZdrinking.
So the blog I started in 2013 because I was really there was limited information about how the spirits that people were buying on the market were really made, and how that production process influenced the flavors that people were getting out of them. There were plenty of places where you could find reviews of like, oh, this new thing came out and it tastes like this and it's good or bad, and maybe you should buy it or not. And but there wasn't as much focused on the production part, and that was what really intrigued me, and what really has sort of driven my sort of passion in this industry. And so that's what I wanted to contribute. So I wanted to be able to post reviews about spirits, but also really kind of have some detail about how they were made as a way to explain the reason why they taste the way they do. And then I made the conscious choice to not rate the spirits, because I remember reading some early whiskey books that had ratings, and they just didn't really mean a lot to me, because I could tell that the writer's preference for the profile of the whiskeys he was reviewing really didn't match my own. And I knew from some other friends that I had, I had a group of friends that I would meet with regularly in San Francisco, and we would, drink different whiskeys and try new things out. And there was a group of them that loved Knob Creek, and I don't. And it's not because Knob Creek's a bad product. It's just has this really strong woody flavor profile that I'm not that crazy about. And they loved it. And so that experience kind of revealed to me that you can have really good spirits that some people will like and some people won't. And not everything is for everybody, but there's enough out there that somebody's going to like it. And so when I approached writing reviews for my blog, I tried to think about who's the audience for this product. If I like it, I'll be pretty clear that I think it's really good. And if I think it's a good product and think it doesn't fit maybe my preferred flavor profile, I tried to imagine like who is the type of person who might really enjoy this. And then some stuff, if it wasn't very good, I usually just didn't write about it because there's other things to do. And so that was really kind of the birth of the idea to try and just post stuff, to start working on writing, improving my writing in this kind of style. And then from that led into me getting a book deal with a publisher. And they approached me in part because a friend of mine, David T. Smith, who's a well-known gin writer, had written a gin dictionary for them. They were looking for somebody who knew about bourbon and who could write, well about it. And so they talked to me and saw what I had written in the past. And so they asked me to write this book, which ended up becoming the Bourbon Bible. And that was a really fun project. And it was it was on a very tight timeline. You often hear about authors taking years to write stuff. And they were like, can you do it in 3 months? I was like, it's a little tight. I might need a little bit more than that. And so, but I got it in, and with some help. And so I had to taste through something like 140 different bourbons.
Wow.
In a few, like 3 months, maybe less. And that really opened my eyes to quite a number of things that I thought was fascinating. There's a lot of and you probably see this in the beer world too, there's a lot of inherited wisdom. And sometimes it's not always that accurate. And, but it's something that somebody said. There was probably a reason for it at the time, but, the world changes and new stuff happens. And so there were little things like a lot of people in the spirits world describe wheated bourbon. So bourbon is made from mostly corn, and then you can have other grains. So usually it's corn, rye, and a little bit of malted barley. But there's a smaller number of bourbons that are made with corn, wheat, and a little bit of malted barley. And those are referred to as wheated bourbons. And so in the industry, people would talk about wheated bourbons as being sweet and soft. And after tasting through a whole bunch of bourbons, a bunch of which I knew had wheat in them, those descriptors didn't make any sense to me. And so I kind of came up with a theory that wheated bourbons aren't really, the wheat itself doesn't really show up in terms of flavor very well in the bourbon. But what it does do is it opens up space for you to taste other production choices and how the whiskey was made, in its distillation, and primarily in its barrel entry proof. And that was fascinating to me. And that was something I hadn't really thought much about before, and was definitely nothing anybody was writing about at the time. And so just as a quick thing, barrel entry proof is just when you make the whiskey, like I said, it'll sometimes be somewhere in the 70% alcohol range. But by law in the US, you can't put whiskey, bourbon in particular, into a barrel above 62.5%. So you have to add some water to bring it down. Now, a lot of the big companies put it in at 62.5 because it saves them the number of barrels that they need to use. But there's an older tradition that will bring it down to 57%. And so what I noticed is that for wheated bourbons in particular, those companies that decided to do a lower barrel entry proof definitely had that softer, sweeter character. But if you put wheated bourbon in at 62.5, it's much more wood centric and can be still good, but a vastly different flavor profile. And so like a good tasting example that I always tell people is, if you want to see this in action, taste Maker's Mark next to Larceny bourbon. Both two wheated bourbons, but one goes in somewhere, I think, at like 55%. I think Maker's is like 110, something like that. And then Larceny goes in at 62.5. And they're vastly different. And they're both wheated bourbons. And so that's a really simple way to just see, like, the old way of describing that style didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And that was I only noticed that because I was tasting so many in such a short period of time. And so that was, I really got a lot out of writing the book. And people seem to really have enjoyed it. So that's been great. So that's, that kind of started me in that progression from the blog into the writing. Is all about trying to help people understand what are the flavors that are coming out of this, and do they match your preference? If not, skip it, go to another one. There's plenty of others that you'll enjoy. You don't have to like everything I like. I'm not, the omniscient, surveyor of all things spirits. But I think there's plenty of things people can taste and really enjoy. And so that's what I try to highlight with a lot of my writing.
Eric, what was the reasoning that the publisher approached you in terms of, I guess, why was bourbon the highlighted spirit that really was a focus? Was that more on your side of things? Was that the publisher's side of things? Was there sort of an absence in the market of literature dedicated towards bourbon?
Yeah, so at the time, there was really the publisher that came to me with the idea, and because of my background and my experience, they felt confident that I could execute their core idea, and I helped them shape it into a book that I thought would be interesting. I added a whole section in the book about how to read a bourbon label, because there are a lot of words on labels that some of which are regulated by the US government, and some are just marketing terms that people use, and they have absolutely no meaning. And so there's all these things combined on a label, and some of them mean stuff and some of them don't, and most people don't know which is which. And so I brought that to the book, and as a way to kind of help people understand what they were getting. But yeah, the publisher had the idea, and because they had a gap in their sort of portfolio of books, and what we ended up putting out was kind of unique at its time, because there had been some other books about world whiskey generally that included bourbon. There were some other books that was like American whiskey generally, so it had bourbon and rye, and they saw the sort of popularity of bourbon and really wanted to hone in on that. And it's done well. It's sold really well.
Eric, take a step back. We've spoken with a few other folks about the differences between the genre of whiskey, right? We know that there are different types of whiskeys. You mentioned the mash bill obviously being an important feature, but can you outline exactly for folks what makes bourbon distinctly different from the rest of the genre that is whiskey? Yeah,
so whiskey at its base is a distilled grain spirit that's usually aged in wood. And so it can be any grain and aged for almost any amount of time, and different countries have different rules. And so that's whiskey kind of generally. And then you have different sort of subtypes or categories. So things like bourbon, like I said before, has to be mostly corn. In the US, rye whiskey has to be mostly from rye. Malt whiskey has to be mostly from malted barley. We now have a new legal category in the US for American single malt. So it has to be 100% malted barley. And other countries have other rules. So in Scotland, you have malt whiskey. It has to be 100% malt spirit, distilled on a pot still, and then aged for a minimum of 3 years. And they have another type called grain whiskey, which is actually more similar to bourbon. and how it's made. It's made on column stills, usually a lot of corn, but they age it in used barrels, and they often distill it to a higher proof. And so it has a different flavor profile, obviously than bourbon. So that's sort of the base. So bourbon is a subgroup of whiskey, in that whiskey is a grain spirit. Bourbon is a corn-based spirit that's aged in a particular way. So over the years, bourbon developed a particular kind of traditional practice, and that traditional practice was eventually codified into law. So the core features of bourbon are that it's mostly corn, and the law says 51% minimum. Almost nobody does 51%. Most of them are more than that. 60 to 80 is more common, but at least 51% corn. It has to be aged in charred barrels, and that goes way back to the early 1800s. Some of the earliest written records we have about bourbon indicate that people were looking for this corn spirit that was aged in charred barrels. That became key to its flavor profile. And that basically, because it was stored in charred barrels, it was able to access more of the wood flavors and color. And so what people noticed why they liked drinking it is you had this sweet whiskey base from the corn that was then extracted a lot of color, this nice amber color that we associate with bourbon and other aged whiskeys. And it had this wood character and sweetness of vanilla and caramel that people really liked that came from the barrel. And so that was really, those things were really key. And then post-prohibition, when they rewrote the alcohol laws in the United States, they added a second requirement for the aging, is that it be in charred new oak barrels. So they added new after prohibition, because the US was in a depression at the time, and the idea was, we'll help keep the coopers, the people who make barrels, employed by requiring all the whiskey made go into new barrels. And so the new part was added as sort of like a jobs measure back in the 30s. And so that's sort of, the basics. And there, like I said before, you can't distill bourbon above 80% alcohol. It has to be lower than that. And you can't put it into a barrel more than 62.5. And even that was different. Before, it was 57, I believe. I think that was the upper limit. But in the 60s, they upped it from 57 to 62.5. The government and the big distillers did a 5-year experiment where they tried a whole bunch of different barreling proof levels, and they settled on 62.5. I think largely because what they found was you kind of maximize your flavor extraction without getting too woody from the barrel at that point. And so they ended up settling on that. But so those are some of the basics about bourbon. It's basically a corn spirit aged in charred new oak barrels. And it's done really well. People really like that flavor. And the interesting consequence of that, using new wood, is that everybody else in the world has basically transitioned from using things like sherry barrels and wine barrels and other things like that to using used bourbon barrels as their cask of choice for single malts around the world, and tequila and rum, and almost everybody else buys bourbon barrels because there's so many of them on the market.
Just because of maybe that 30s clause that there had to be new charred, I suppose. It increased the supply a little bit, but that's really interesting. I like that you mentioned that. Sort of segues into what a little something I wanted to ask about, and I noticed that on your website, you have a component for consulting, which is really cool. But a little bit further down, there's an aspect of barrel management. So I guess obviously a little bit about barrels and how they work and what goes into that. Could you give us a little rundown on how that works? Like what's barrel management? Is there something that should go into it, or do you have a special style of it?
Yeah, so barrel management is basically, the idea that once you distill a spirit, put it into a barrel, each barrel is going to mature slightly differently. And there's a variety of reasons for this that we don't fully understand yet. Sazerac has been doing a long-term experiment where they're aging the same whiskey in barrels made from different portions of one tree. It's really trying to hone in on what aspects of the wood allow some barrels to age very long, and some barrels need to be pulled and dumped sooner. What ends up happening is you could have the same basically two barrels filled at the same time, and within 4 years, one of those barrels will taste ready to pour, and the other one won't yet, and so they'll let the other one go. But if you go too long, then you get too much wood out of that other barrel, and so there's a sort of art and science into barrel management. And by and large, in the US, the practice has been fill the barrels, put them in a warehouse, and just kind of forget about them a little bit. And, based on the way the warehouses are built over time, they develop these maps that inside the warehouses, there are temperature and humidity gradients up and down and side to side. And so the companies over time sort of figured out, okay, south-facing upper floor is going to develop at a faster rate than a north-facing lower floor. And so when they're making their barrel picks for a particular style of whiskey, or flavor profile for a whiskey, they know, okay, we need to pull mostly from this area or from that area. And we know in general, we're going to kind of hit these flavor targets from them. So that's sort of been the more common practice for a long time for the big guys, is just kind of leave them. In France, they have a much more hands-on tradition for making cognac, which is a type of French brandy, and Armagnac, and where they will move barrels from one cellar to another, and they will top barrels up, and they will do other things. And in France, they have a tradition of using what they call it as a dry cellar and a wet cellar. When they move a barrel from one to the other, what they're doing is trying to control how much alcohol versus water is evaporating over time. And so when you put liquid into a barrel, including alcohol, what happens is there is a gradient between the concentration of alcohol in the barrel and the concentration of alcohol outside the barrel. And because of, physics and thermodynamics and all sorts of things, what happens is that over time, the liquid inside the barrel tries to match the conditions outside the barrel. And so if you have a dry environment outside of the barrel, more water will evaporate from the inside of the barrel because it's trying to move from a position of high humidity to low humidity. And in converse, when you have a humid cellar where it's lots of water in the air, you have a gradient from lower humidity to higher humidity. And so what happens is you lose more alcohol over time because the alcohol is trying to move to the higher humidity environment, low alcohol environment, to equalize between the two regions. It's really fascinating how it works. Yeah. And that gets, that changes depending on, again, how hot you are, how high up in a warehouse you might be, how humid it is, and what side, the sun is hitting the building. And so it's a really cool process. So anyway, you have to kind of take all this information and think about, okay, if I'm looking for a whiskey that's going to hit certain flavor profiles, then we need to think about how and where we're pulling from in our warehouse and what the temperature gradients and humidity gradients are doing, and what's our target that we're aging for in terms of time. Are we looking for like a 4 to 6 year old whiskey? Are we looking for a 6 to 8 year old whiskey? Or are you trying to go real far out, to like 25? And you need different types of barrel management and also warehouse environments for those sorts of things. So anyway, so that's all, that part is something I've gotten into more recently, and it's been really fascinating to kind of think about all of these factors that are going on. Because in the 1980s in Scotland, I've read interviews of old distillers and warehouse managers. They just put the barrels away and they're like, I don't know, we'll see what happens. and they just had no idea really why things were happening they were the way they did. A lot of it was just serendipity that like Scotch, for example, pairs really well with sherry, and England imported a ton of sherry because they drank a lot of it, and they had all these barrels, and the Scots were like, yeah, we'll buy cheap barrels, sure, and then we'll put our whiskey into it. and it worked out really well, and everybody's like, oh, I want it. And there's not enough sherry barrels in the world to go around, and so they have to like make them. They have to like kind of fake them a little bit to get the flavor character. But anyway, so that's sort of what barrel management is about. It's trying to, so you have your whiskey that you're making, and you have to think about, okay, how are these barrels maturing over time, and how are we going to pull from those over time to create the target flavor profiles that we want.
That is super interesting. I guess I was probably just as naive as maybe people back in the day, just put it in a barrel and throw it in the warehouse. I knew, obviously, I knew that came from, you'd use different types of wood and things like that. But like you said, getting into humidity in certain parts of the warehouse and temperatures, it's crazy. But I guess you have to have that in this day and age with, all the differentiation in different spirits and whatnot. The the granular details, pun intended, I guess, really matter. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and like I said, like this is all stuff that has really developed, the knowledge around it has really developed in a more concrete way in the last, I don't know, probably 20 years. And which is kind of wild to believe, to know. And like that simple thing, like I mentioned before about barrel entry proof, how strong do you put the spirit in? A lot of people just didn't think about it. A lot of even current distillers, they pick 62.5 because it's the most economical, and because they don't, for craft distillers in particular, they don't often have a lot of warehouse space, so they're just like, I'm going to maximize what I can do and just put it in at 62.5 without thinking about, oh, what's the flavor consequences down the road. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, depends on their other environmental factors. So like Texas is a great example. Texas has this really intense climate, as you may know, and it really speeds up the maturation. And so you can have a 3-year-old, 4-year-old whiskey coming out of Texas that tastes just as mature as like a 6-year-old bourbon coming out of Kentucky. And it's nothing that, the barrels are similar, the mash bills are similar, but it's that added intensity of the environment that really speeds things up. And there are some really great examples of relatively young bourbons and whiskeys coming out of Texas, but they taste fantastic because of the environment.
Eric, does bourbon production and the commercial side of bourbon, does that rule the roost in terms of the commercial market of the United States? Is bourbon by far the most popular whiskey in the market?
Yes, it is. It's by far the most popular. So there's an organization in the US called the Distilled Spirits Council, and they publish public information about sales for different spirits categories in the US. And they group together bourbon and Tennessee whiskey because they're the same thing. They're just made slightly different in different states. So that's a little bit controversial statement for some people, but the legal definition of Tennessee whiskey is that it's a bourbon produced in the state of Tennessee. So, so some people get all ruffled feathers about that, but they're the same thing, basically, just made slightly differently in different states. And anyway,
folks in Kentucky might not like you saying that, maybe.
Well, it started, I think, primarily because the Tennessee whiskey people were like, Kentucky bourbon is a thing, so let's not compete with that. Let's just call it Tennessee whiskey, and it's a different thing now. And so we don't have to compete with them. making bourbon, we're making Tennessee whiskey. It's basically the same thing though. So it's partly I think it's a pretty clever, I think, marketing strategy. I don't know that they necessarily thought of it that way initially, but it was a really easy way for them to differentiate themselves. And, as a result, Jack Daniel's is the number one selling whiskey and American whiskey in the US. And, it's a Tennessee whiskey. It's not a Kentucky bourbon. So anyway, but those two combined they're grouped together for their sales because they're virtually identical. And it's huge. It's huge. Rye whiskey, which you would think from all that's written about it and, all the fanfare that it gets, it's like 5% of bourbon in a Tennessee whiskey. It's minuscule. It's incredible, the drop off. And so it's really fascinating how, there are fantastic ryes out there for sure. And they're really different, which is one of the fun things about rye whiskey is that you can have a much larger flavor spectrum for rye whiskey than you do in bourbon. And yet it's a much smaller percentage of the overall market. So bourbon's kind of king in terms of that. Vodka is huge as well. I don't remember the current rankings, but they're pretty close in terms of volumes, I believe. And then after that, it kind of drops off. For other spirit styles, gin and rum and brandy are much smaller categories overall. Whiskey and vodka are the two big leaders in the US when it comes to sales.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, before we're coming a little bit close to the end of our discussion, unfortunately, but before we get there, I definitely want to spend a little bit of time. You also wrote another book entitled The Tequila Dictionary. So you're not just a bourbon man by any means. So, all right, quick Cole's notes. What is tequila and where does it come from?
So tequila is a distilled spirit made from the agave plant. And tequila has to be made primarily in Jalisco. And then there are like 4 other states, most of which surround Jalisco. There are portions of these other states in Mexico that are allowed to produce tequila. And then there's another state way on the east coast of Mexico that's allowed to make tequila. I don't really know why. Doesn't really have a lot of historic tradition. Would probably involve some money at some point. That's all. But that's my guess. But anyway, so tequila is a particular type of agave spirit made in a particular region of Mexico. So in the same way that cognac and Armagnac are 2 different types of French brandy made in different regions, tequila and mezcal and some other versions, Bacanora and Raicilla, are different types of agave spirits made in different regions of Mexico. So tequila is the most well-known, sells the vast, majority of the volume is tequila. It's huge now. And mezcal is growing very quickly, but it's much smaller in terms of volume of sales. But the agave is a fascinating plant, and it makes, I think, a fantastic distilled spirit. So most spirits are made from annual plants that grow in one year are harvested, and then you regrow them the next year to make the plant. Agaves are not annuals. They grow for many years. They flower once in their life, and then they die. And so the job of the distiller is to harvest the plants before they die. And so they have to find, the ideal is you harvest the plant sort of right before it's ready to flower or right after it's flowered, when it's at the peak of its ripeness and sugar content. And once you harvest that plant, it's done, and you have to replant a different plant, and you have to wait another 5 to 10 to 20 years for the next one to grow and ripen. So it's really different. And so because of that, there have been lots of periods of really high swings in cost for agaves, because as demand will grow, and so a lot of people will start planting, but there's this delayed curve for when the plants are ready. And often what we've seen is there's been a decline in demand, but then there's this giant wave of ripe plants. And so the price of plants plummets below production cost. And then people start ripping out their fields, and then demand picks back up. And now the price of agaves grows through the roof again. And so we're in this unique period where demand has not stopped. It's continued to grow. And so there's just not, people are having a hard time keeping up with the growth of new plants to meet that demand. So anyway, it's a really fascinating spirit. And so initially, before the legal terms were created, most spirits in Mexico from the agave were referred to in some version of mezcal or vino de mezcal. And then tequila was basically this, tequila is the name of a town in Jalisco. And it got recognized as being particularly good. And so the vino de mezcal, de tequila, basically the distilled spirit of mezcal from the plant in the town of Tequila, was kind of what people referred to it as. And then eventually they just dropped all that other stuff and just called it tequila as a shorthand. And the thing that really differentiated tequila from mezcal was a technological shift. So a lot of mezcal is made where they roast the agaves in an earthen pit. And so they will basically build like a big bonfire of hardwoods. And once the coals are all hot, they will pile on lava rocks, and then they'll put the plants on top of that, and then they'll cover that with dirt, and they'll like steam and cook in this earthen pit for maybe a week. And that basically helps hydrolyze the sugars and converts the primary starch source, which is called inulin. So it's a soluble fiber. It's different than starch and grains and other things. And so the inulin breaks apart in the presence of water and heat into fructose, which is a fermentable sugar, which is mostly found in fruits. And so then they would distill that, but because of that cooking process in the earth with the logs right there, often it would be very smoky in its flavor profile. And so the sort of innovation in tequila was that they stopped using these earthen pits. And instead, they transferred the cooking to these brick ovens that were above ground and were steam injected. And so it accomplished the same task, but without the smoke flavor. And people really liked it. And you see the same sort of thing happen in Scotch. A long time ago, all Scotch was peated because of the production process. But then over time, new technologies allowed the production of malted barley without peat smoke. And then people started liking this new style of Scotch where it wasn't super smoky anymore. And so then they blend in a little bit just for character. And you saw, so the same thing happened in tequila in Mexico. People started moving away from the smoky character of mezcal, and they liked this tequila flavor, the agave flavor without the smoke influence. And so it blew up and it became a big thing. And in the 1970s in the US, it became very popular for a variety of reasons, partly because there was sort of a downturn in whiskey preferences. And the Rolling Stones were doing a world tour, and the stories are that they basically took tequila everywhere with them and were making tequila sunrises, and everybody loves the Rolling Stones. So people started drinking tequila partly because of them and partly because it was different than what their parents drank. And so anyway, it's a fascinating, complex plant and spirit in of itself, and it's very different than whiskey. And I love it. It's fantastic. It's I have a special place in my heart for it. And my preference leans to unaged agave spirits. Wood can easily cover over the flavors of the agave if you're not careful. But there's a few distillers who know how to handle wood with agave, and you can get some really good examples of long aged tequilas. but they spent most of their time in very, used wood barrels that didn't have a lot of character to give. But it was mostly just oxidation over time. So anyway, it's
Right.
a great thing.
Yeah, Eric, is there a reason you created the Bourbon Bible and then the Tequila Dictionary?
So again, that was a request of my publisher. So the publisher has a whole series of dictionaries. So they have one on coffee, they have one on whiskey, they have one on gin, and they wanted one on tequila. And so they talked to me because I had already done the Bourbon Bible for them, and they wanted to know if I at the time that they asked me, I was actually living in Mexico with my family, and they asked me if I felt comfortable doing it. And I was like, of course I can do this. It's not a problem. And so yeah, so that's why it's in a dictionary format, because it's part of a sort of series that the publisher already has. And it was something that I knew how to do easily.
Yeah, interesting. Just thought that was kind of funny why one is more of a religious text and one is more
Yeah.
in
Well,
the
that's the
definition
thing.
category.
It's like, the publisher, the way they think about it is like there are these different styles of books that people are reading and for different reasons and different ways. And so they have like these series of books that are dictionary formats, and they have the Bourbon Bible, which is more of this like in-depth look at one thing. And then my most recent book I did for them was an atlas style book. So each chapter looks at one type of whiskey from one state. So we have Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, Missouri bourbon, Texas bourbon, and then 4 states for rye: Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and Indiana for rye. And then American single malt from the Pacific Northwest, and Southern smoked whiskeys. And Southern's very broad in that geographic region. But they had this idea of wanting to highlight this idea of sort of regional styles of whiskey, which was very strong in the early part of the US, and then gradually sort of died off, and whiskey became mostly Kentucky and Tennessee. But with the birth of craft spirits, these more regional styles of whiskey have started to reemerge. And that was so anyway, that was a fun project that I was able to do for them as well. And that was, again, partly their thinking was like, we have these different kind of formats for books. They have a wine atlas, they have a world whiskey atlas, which is very big, but they had this idea to kind of create an atlas for American whiskey and bourbon. And so it has these more geographic focus.
Eric, this is beyond fascinating. I feel like Garrett and I could occupy a few more hours of your time to learn a little bit more about whiskey creation, cultivation, history in the United States. It's so vast, and you have such a massive wealth of knowledge. Maybe, again, we don't want to keep you for too long. I think maybe I'll end on this question. Do you have any other future publications coming out? Any other focuses? Potentially a different spirit? What's next for you?
In terms of books, I don't know. I have another book idea that I've been thinking about developing for a while about agave spirits generally. Obviously, Mexico is the birthplace of agave spirits. It's the heart of it. But there are really interesting things happening now in the US, in India, in Australia, in South Africa, in Sicily. So agave spirits is really is starting to become more global. And so I've been germinating an idea about kind of looking at that a bit. But other than that, I've been doing some other writing for Distiller Magazine and for some other publications that'll be coming out. And more recently, I've been doing a little less writing and more on the consulting side. And so I'm trying to have a balance of those things. But the books are really fun to do, especially when you have a good publisher and they have a clear idea of what they want. It makes it simpler to put something out.
Amazing. Well, Eric, we look forward to reading and seeing future publications, future books, potentially. Eric Zandona, runs EZdrinking, a spirits blog and consultancy, as well as the author of the 2 texts that we spoke about, the Bourbon Bible and the Tequila Dictionary. Eric, we really appreciate your time. And if you'll come back and help us out a little bit more with all this information you have, we'd love to have you.
You bet. I loved it. And there's so many more other spirits to talk about. And yeah, they're just fantastic. And they all exist in their own little universe. And so there's so much history and technology and craft that goes into each style. So I'm happy to come back and talk.
All right. Thanks so much, Eric. Talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.